Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another Live with Kevin. So excited that you're here. Whether you're here actually live or whether you're with us later, I'm so glad that you're here. And if you're with us live, say hello. Go into the comments section of whatever social platform you're on right now and say hello. Tell us where you're located. We'd love to know that. And really, I have an ulterior motive. I want to know where you're from. That's kind of cool to know, because we've had people from all over the world on these shows, but I'm not asking that question from a vanity perspective. I'm asking that question for you to do that for your benefit, not mine. Here's what I mean. If I want you to imagine that you were joining my guest and I, who are not at the same table. We are halfway across the world from each other. But if we were around a table and you were joining us, if you had a question, you'd ask it, right? If you had a comment, you'd share it. If you had an idea, you would offer it. I want you to do that even though we're not in physical proximity. And so by getting you to say hello first, I've got you using your fingers and getting you focused on engaging in this conversation. It will be a better conversation for your input, eventually be a better podcast too. If you didn't notice that will be, whoops, over here. I continue to get that wrong, everybody. Up there over that corner of my shoulder, you will see that this eventually will be an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And so now that I've welcomed you that are here live or on video in some way, I'm going to do this is where we'll trim this for the podcast. So Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. Success. We all have a definition of it in our heads, but might have a hard time describing it in words. And even if we can easily define it and describe it, we likely have mixed feelings about success. As leaders, we are striving for some version of success for ourselves, our teams, and our organizations. So getting a clearer picture on what it is critical to, well, our success. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast in the future, you could join us live on your favorite social channel. You can get all of those future live episodes and therefore interact with us, see all of them sooner by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just 2 of the places, not the only ones, but 2 of the places where we do live stream these episodes. First, so you can go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to learn more about those groups and get connected there so you can find out when you can join us live. And of course, all things about this podcast can be found at remarkablepodcast.com. Today's episode is brought to you by my latest book. For those of you on the podcast, it's either just about to come out or has recently come out. The book is called Flexible Leadership: Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world that is more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective and a new set of tools to create the great results their organizations and team members want and need. That's where flexible leadership comes in, and that's what it can provide you. You can learn more and order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. That shouldn't be too surprising. remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. And with that, let me bring in my guest, Adrian Kelly, joining us from across the pond, we might say. Let me introduce him to you. Adrian Kelly is a recognized sports and performance coach. He's an author. He's an award-winning lawyer and a sought-after guest speaker on subjects ranging from motivation, high performance, life direction, sustainable success, and positive psychology. He has lectured and been an external examiner in the Law Society of Ireland, where he is currently undertaking a master's degree in psychology. He has a keen interest in promoting sport and well-being and is the current chairman of the Peace Link Sport Complex Clones in Ireland, with a broad spectrum of sports coaching experience from senior inter-country ladies Gaelic football to amateur baseball, both domestically and internationally, with the U18 Irish international team at 2 European championships. He also works closely with a number of high schools, pioneering the Dragon's Den programs and competitions for students and overseeing a college scholarship program. Today, we're talking about his new book, The Success Complex: Ancient Wisdom, the Building Blocks of Life, and Your Path to Sustained success. Adrian,
Thanks, Kevin. That was a hell of an
welcome.
introduction. That was a real mouthful. Yeah,
Yeah, it
I'm
really
humbled.
was. And I was talking a little too fast.
That's okay.
But here we are. And man, I'm so excited to have you today for us to talk about your new book, The Success Complex, but really not to talk about the book as much as what's inside of the book. That's what matters the most. But before we do that, one of the things I've learned in doing the show, Adrian, 470 some episodes in, is that the people that join me are not only smart and accomplished, but they're interesting. And so I'm kind of curious. You didn't wake up when you were 5 and say, I'm going to sort of be a sports and performance coach, right? So, like, what's the journey? How do you end up in this spot? And then we'll get to the book. But what's the journey that leads you to doing this kind of work?
Well, that's a great question, Kevin. And I'm humbled to have this on the screen above me here. Remarkable leadership.
See, you did a better job than I did. You pointed to it correctly.
Which hand is it? This one. So, yeah, I mean, I started out my career as a criminal solicitor or lawyer, as you would say, in the US. So I've had a few careers, and I spent about 6 years doing that. But you brought me right back to my childhood. And, I wasn't one of those kids that thought I would do this or do that when I grew up. Ireland in the 1980s was a lot about survival, really. It was, it was a difficult upbringing, not from a family perspective, but a societal perspective. We live right on the border, about a mile from what was then a hard militarized border in the North and South Ireland. Very, very different world than it is today. If you drive around Ireland, you wouldn't even see evidence of that border here today. So it's changed a lot, and we're a very kind of forward-thinking country compared to where we were. But I wasn't a great student at school, struggled. I lost my mother at an early age when I was 10, and that had a dramatic effect, I think, on my motivation at school and everything else. And in the end, anyway, I didn't do well in my final exams in high school, so I had to repeat, so I did the year again and improved the results dramatically, and then went on and ultimately ended up in what you would call law school, and did quite well there, and ended up back lecturing in the law school where they train solicitors, doing that part-time, and also practicing as a criminal solicitor. And then during the crash back in 2009, 2010, I decided to move on, because what the government decided to do was to slash all legal aid, which paid my fees, governmental fees. Even though we're in a private practice, we were heavily reliant on money from the government to provide defense to criminals, and that was paid for by the government, and that was slashed by 25%. It hasn't gone back up a lot since, but I moved on. A friend of mine was starting a renewable energy company, needed a business partner, and so I did that for the following 8 or 9 years, and we built up about 30 staff, and we'd sold a lot of products out of China into America, as it happened, renewable energy products. And then I moved out of that company, and I moved on to consultancy and training. I work with the government. I work with big law firms, provide training and education. And you mentioned some sports there. I played a little baseball, amateur baseball here. I played in Arizona twice, actually, out there in the MSBL, and that was quite an interesting journey back in the day. And also, I got into Gaelic football, you mentioned, which is probably very alien to, although it's growing in the States, it's very alien probably to a lot of your listeners, and that's kind of, and I actually work with a team. It's a ladies Gaelic football team, which is very popular over here. Last year one of our games, I think we had 15,000 people at the game. It's a big sport here, and the men's is also a big sport here. So my interest gravitated and flowed and fluctuated in various directions, and has settled on the area of performance. And I'm currently doing a master's degree in performance psychology in the University of Wales, actually, as it happened, distance learning. And I've spent the last 4 years researching and writing the book on a subject matter which I find very interesting, which is how to get the best out of ourselves. And I suppose how to define that sense of direction and what we want to achieve in life.
So you really answered that second question about why you wrote the book. It's related to your life journey. It's related to the work you're doing for your master's degree as well. And
Yeah.
You've tackled a slippery topic. How about that? Like we have all sorts of definitions of it. I hinted at that in the open. And so, you wrote the book. So you could give us yours, which I'd like, but I'd also like, because you've written this, you've heard lots of people's definitions. So I'm curious what your observations are about sort of what's floating around in people's heads about what success is, and then maybe compare that with what you would suggest it should be.
Perfect. Well, let me answer that in two ways. One, the reason I wrote the book, I've read a lot of positive psychology or books in the positive psychology genre. And what I find is there's kind of a jungle of information out there, some of which can seem a little bit contradictory, etc. So one of my goals in writing the book was to put in place a framework which would hopefully go beyond the book. People that read the book will have this framework, hopefully to assess new information beyond the information in the book, where they can attach and make sense of that positive psychology genre and see where it fits for them. And the structure I adopted for the book was kind of a pyramid structure, 7 chapters on skills you might acquire to overcome challenge, 5 chapters on how to achieve balance in order to sustain that progress or success journey, and finally 3 chapters on direction, as in what are things worth having more of in our lives. And what I found in researching the book, there's a lot of very valuable behavioral science and positive psychology research and information out there, which is largely inaccessible to the general public. And I thought it would be fun to write a book that mixed some of those learnings with some of my personal journey, but also with events and people that we're very familiar with throughout history, stories about them that we think we're familiar with, but stories that they might not realize what drove their success, the insights that kind of helped them achieve certain goals, and also what sustained their success in many cases over multiple decades. And I focus on people like Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, big events like the NASA shuttle crash, the Challenger crash, World War II, etc., etc., etc. So all events I think people will be broadly familiar with, but explored, I hope, in a very new and exciting way with interest and up-to-date insights on performance and behavioral science. So then we come to the subject of success. And of course, growing up, you asked me about my childhood, we all, I suppose, define success in an early stage of development as personal possessions or a nice car or house or even an achievement, winning a trophy or whatever else. That's certainly objective poster boy success, let's call it. But what you come to realize about success after researching and writing about it and having many, many conversations is that, number one, it's highly subjective. It's what that word success means to us. Secondly, success is fleeting. It's non-permanent. So usually if we achieve one thing, for example, winning a trophy, usually the competition starts the very next day for the following year. So it's fleeting, it's momentary. And third, it's rarely done alone. Success is usually a team sport. It's done with the help or assistance of others, or in many cases to help others achieve their success. And as such, you kind of have a success in that for yourself. So that's how broadly I would define it, I suppose. And it's difficult to define. How you get there and how you achieve it is a whole other conversation.
And that's the conversation we're going to have. But it's that last point that success is rarely an individual thing, but in fact that it's a team sport is one of the reasons why I asked you to be here. And I sort of again teed that up in the open when I suggested that as leaders, we've got to get some clarity around this for ourselves, just like any other human. Better human equals better leader, and vice versa. But also so that we can help others. Because how do we help? If leadership, and I believe that leadership is about reaching valuable outcomes with and through others, both of those are things that we can influence. And so how do we make that happen? So why is it that you think that there is so much consternation or challenge with the word? Because you call this the success complex. Like there's a lot going on in our heads about it. And we all say we want it. And yet, what's the challenge here? Like what's sort of going on in our heads that in some cases keep us, we self-sabotage, etc. Why the challenge?
So the success complex, and you can interpret that in two ways. Complex in the sense it is difficult. There's it's multifaceted, etc., and hard to understand. Complex in the sense of the book, I also mean it in the sense of what if we had a complex about heights or small spaces, a fear of something that was a blind spot we couldn't see that was stopping us achieving something or climbing that ladder, let's say. Well, I mean it in that sense also. What's your success complex? What's holding you back? What's that invisible force out there that are within you that is stopping you from achieving one particular goal or another? So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from the book's perspective. Now, you ask a very interesting question and an interesting comment, I should say, which is it's a team sport. Now, I'm going to skip right towards the end of the book here, so spoiler alert for readers. But what we examine in the final chapters is, for example, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory. And in the early 1940s, as many people who've studied any sort of business course will have come across Maslow, he had this pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid was, food, shelter, our hygiene needs, as in sustaining ourselves, then self-esteem, and so on and so forth, up this ladder, up this pyramid, I should say. And at the top of the pyramid was self-actualization, being all we can be as people. But towards the end of his life, in the late 1960s, and he died around 1970, in his personal papers, he said, I might have got this wrong. In fact, I think I did. He said that it wasn't self-actualization that was the most important, fulfilling thing in his experience on reflection. It was actually self-transcendence. Self-transcendence, not in a religious sense, but more in the sense of true fulfillment is usually found in what we can do for others. Now, again, that does sound terribly religious. We've all heard that somewhere before. But I think there's a lot in that. And people that come towards the end of their life, people that very famous examples, I include one in the book of Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense for JFK, former president of the World Bank, former president of Ford Motor Company, etc., super high achieving guy. At the end of his life, there's a great documentary released in the cinemas a few years back called The Fog of War. He talks in depth about if only he could have spent more time trying to put himself in the shoes of others. Particularly, he talks about the Vietnam War, a 19-year-long war, which perhaps could have been avoided. And he had a meeting in 1995 with his counterpart, Secretary of Defense for Vietnam at the time. They met in 1995, and he says he quickly discovered that had we spent more time trying to understand their position, they saw America perhaps as a colonial kind of force coming in to colonize South Vietnam. We could have resolved, at least avoided the war. That was his opinion. And I think the point is self-transcendence, not only in the sense of helping other people to succeed and being part of their journey, and being a team effort, but also self-transcendence in the sense that how can we get past ourselves and see the other side of the fence and collaborate together, because we're all on a small planet here. There's no easy way off this planet, and particularly for society has become so polarized. Every more so every week and month that goes by, I think we need a little bit more of that in the conversation in terms of how do we get back to seeing other people's point of view and working together. And I think that's a very worthwhile related aspect of success, in my opinion.
So in the book you talk about, and you've used different words just now, which is perfectly fine, but in the book you talk about the ABC, and the book is sort of laid out as ABC, abilities, balance, and congruence. And that's that last piece that we've just been talking about. So since we started at the back, let's go backward, but not to the beginning, but to the middle, because one of the things I love about the book are the chapters on balance, because and maybe in part because it has a connection to the book that I talked about at the top of the show, is my next book, Flexible Leadership. But the longer I live, the more I think understanding balance, competing tensions, what I like to call flexors, are a critical need for us. And I think the source of wisdom, if you will. And so let's talk about what you mean by balance, and give us a couple of examples of these tensions that we run into as we're now moving in the direction of these things that we would call success.
So that's a great question. So the middle part of the book, which I mentioned, which has 5 chapters, it explores, first of all, how we can go wrong. So as individuals, we lose our balance, lose our way. And there's lots of examples out there in terms of ambitious, hardworking, skilled people who just make bad decisions at critical junctures, and it sends them down a bad path, which ultimately sabotages them and unfortunately many others along the way. And I talk about the example of Nick Gleeson, Barings Bank, lost £830 million, but a couple of bad decisions and gambles he shouldn't have taken, which he would admit himself. Jordan Belfort, Wolf of Wall Street, I try to pick examples which are big and bold and extreme examples. And again, there's a guy who employed approximately 1,000 people at the age of 26. He obviously had some skills, a lot of charisma, a lot of drive, but again, some bad decisions, and a lot of bad decisions drove his career off the rails, But towards the end of that middle part of the book, then we get to something particularly interesting, not that that's not interesting, which is how, number one, how we can gradually go wrong from a fraud perspective, etc., but also a loss of balance in terms of our health. And I think everything starts with our well-being. When we talk about success, we can't ignore that as a fundamental, because we're not going to be around to enjoy anything else if we can't take care of ourselves. So recognizing and looking after our stress levels and work hard, yes, but also get good replenishing recovery is a very interesting conversation for me. And one of the most interesting interviews I had around this subject was with a gentleman called Dr. Ken Van Summeren, who appears in the book. And he is a physiologist. He was the director of the Great Britain Olympic team up until the 2012 Olympics, one of the record medal hauls up to that date. And he talks about building our bank of resilience and exposure to stressful situations with appropriate recovery, rest, replenishment can actually build our battery bank for dealing with difficult situations. Now, he uses some extreme examples. One of which, incidentally, is the loss of a parent, which I have some personal experience of early in their life, and how it can be a catastrophic experience without the right supports to recover. And not everybody does, but he found that certainly people that push themselves to extreme achievement in the Olympics or in various sports tend to be people that have coped with a lot of setbacks in their life, sometimes major setbacks. And the lesson there, I suppose, is not that that's desired in any way, but it's an extreme example of the benefit of exposing ourselves to some level of risk, some level of stress, difficult situations, and then allowing recovery. And unlike your iPhone, where you plug it in and charge it and recharge it, the battery replenishes over time. Your battery can actually grow in terms of your ability to be resilient and your ability to have that extra energy and to make whatever progress and achievement you're trying to achieve more sustainable. I think that's such an interesting conversation and not well known, I don't think.
No, one of the things that I was just thinking as you were sharing that is that you and I'm confident, could have a full episode on every chapter in the book. And that's you're certainly not the first person that I've thought that of in the context of the show, because we've been blessed to have a lot of really, really smart folks here. And yet I think that's a really important piece. I think that there are too many leaders who are pushing themselves for the purpose of supporting and serving their teams and their organizations. And yet, if we're not restoring, if we're not replenishing, what I've been saying ever since really at the beginning of the pandemic is that taking care of ourselves is not selfish, right? Yeah. Like, do we have to do that? If we can't do that, then we can't be at our best for our teams. And oh, by the way, to your point, if we do it well, we actually build our resilience, which I think is a really, really useful thought. The rest of the book, since we worked from the bottom or the end of the book.
Can I add one point there, Kevin? Apologies. Please. And I'll jump in that middle section when I talked about individuals losing their way. I meant to mention as well before the stress was collective groupthink, where if we surround ourselves with the wrong people or get into an organization that has perhaps a flawed ethos, and I use Enron, for example, as an extreme example in the book, there's often a regression towards the mean. If you've got way over here, you've got good people, way over here, you've got people with ill intent. In the middle, sometimes the gravitational pull of our decision making and our moral compass gets compromised, and it's the ability to recognize that, the ability to be able to try and fix it, and if not, perhaps exit the situation. But it's use the phrase to boil a frog in water, where the water is getting hot, and we can see the warning signs. It's knowing those warning signs and be able to exit at the right time is also a very, very important skill when we work in teams and surround ourselves with a particular group of people.
Yeah, I love that. So there are 7 of the skills or abilities that you talk about, and we can't get to all of them. I'm going to pick a couple, in part because I love the way you framed them, right? So I'm going to start with the last one, keeping with our theme, what the heck, of working from the end of the book up. The last of the 7 abilities you talk about is, you say, You say never lose again, and I like, okay,
Mm.
that is. There are a couple others of them that are a little more intuitive, right? Like
Yeah.
defining potential, like, okay, right? Like we can kind of have a clue, but people aren't gonna have any clue what you mean by never lose again. So talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think to never lose again is, regardless of the short-term outcome from any adventure or exploit, it's what we gain personally from the endeavor that really counts. So when we talk about never lose again, we don't really lose if we're doing things that are important to us and perhaps important to community and society more widely, even if the short-term defined goal isn't always achieved. And it's important to push ourselves and grow as people. And in the book, I talk about Mystery at Logan Airport, where there was a study done around the danger that security people at an airport had. I suppose let's call it their danger radar or whatever for searching people. And it had gone to this level after 9/11, understandably. And it hadn't dropped much, even though customer compliance at the airport, people going through the airport security, compliance had gone way up. They were still searching as many people as ever. And it's because our brains have an efficiency mechanism that the more it can kick over to our autopilot, the better. The less we have to analyze, the less we have to reappraise, the less energy our brain has to use. So we also have to be conscious, be careful that your autopilot doesn't kick in and send us in a unproductive direction. And here, what the professors that studied this phenomenon found was that if people are presented with a lot of information to digest, generally we get a little bit lazy, and we set a barometer here, and it doesn't really change. And we need to be careful with that, because as we get older, and as we maybe push ourselves a little bit less sometimes, our world can close in on top of us. And I talk from time to time about my own personal experience. I don't write about it in the book, but my father, as he got older, he sadly passed away last year. He used to be a sales guy, and he was on the phone, he was making deals, he was selling cars, he was a really outgoing sort of guy. But as he got older, and this can happen to all of us, the world seemed to close in on him, and to make a phone call was a struggle. It was a big task in his mind. And I'd come home, I was a solicitor at the time, come home, and he still hadn't made the one phone call he was supposed to make. I'd make the phone call that's dealt with. So we can build things up in our mind. And to relate all that back to the book, what they found with the airport security people was a thing called problem creep. The more that the more that we become a comfortable society and stop seeking out challenge and pushing ourselves to do hard but worthwhile things, well, then the things that didn't seem as tough a year ago can seem tougher. There's a great book called The Comfort Crisis on this, which centers on this. And we have to always be wary that to challenge ourselves, to grow as people, to take on challenge, to ensure that our world doesn't shrink around us in terms of what we're capable of doing in terms of skill set, and also our broad outlook on challenge, I suppose, to summarize. I don't know how well I worded that, but that's a summary of what that chapter's message is. So the growth is in the endeavor, not always in the short-term result, is how I'd summarize it.
Yeah, I do love that. I want to do one more of them before we sort of roll in and finish our conversation. And that is the chapter right in front of it, which is increasing your luck. I'm going to read the quote that you open the chapter with. Opportunity does not waste time with those who are unprepared, which probably frames this up as well as anything. Tell me what you mean about how we can increase our luck.
Yeah, so it seems it's quite provocative. How can you increase your luck? Luck is luck. So what I talk about there is what can seem like luck. That guy's lucky at me. He always gets the breaks, whatever. It commonly is about us having the right skill set and diversified skill set to take advantage of opportunities as they present themselves. And that can often seem like luck to others. God, that guy, he gets asked to do everything, that guy. How come he gets all the breaks? So, or lady, I should say. In the book, I talk about two stories. One is a school principal of a local school here told me the story firsthand, and it was of a bicycle that she had saw in a shop window when she was 10 years old in a very real black spot of unemployment in West Belfast in the early 1980s, and unemployment rates were 20-30% at the time. And it was actually in that area that, remember Back to the Future, you know the movie Back to the Future, the DeLorean in Back to the Future was made in that area, Dunmurry of Belfast, and the factory just closed down the year earlier with 1,500 job losses. So it was decimated economically. Nobody had any money, and her father was sick, and nobody was really working. And she told me she used to have to put coins into the meter at the house to keep the electricity on in the house, and she used to have to study by the light of the street poles outside in through the windows because they didn't have enough money to keep the power on at night. But she spotted this bicycle in the window, a bicycle that she could never have in a million years, just didn't have the money. But there was a draw to win the bicycle. And so her and her sister, they came up with a plan. In that kind of, let's say, supermarket, people would pack their bags. People would do their shop, and then they'd wheel their trolley over to pack their bags. And each person who shopped there got a form to fill out, and they had to complete the title, shop at crazy prices because. And it was like, Crazy Prices was the shop, and because it's great, because of whatever. And it was too much effort. People discarded these. And what her and her sister did, they went in every day and picked up these discarded forms, filled out the caption, wrote their name on it, and entered the draw. And they did that all summer long for about 6 weeks, and she won the bicycle. And it's such a great example of consistency, of observation. She was able, at 10 years old, she was able to observe what was happening here. Timing, because obviously she had to be quick to get in to grab them before they were cleaned up and put back in a stack. But most of all, the ability to visualize something which seems impossible, but to consistently work towards in a meaningful way. Well, there's still risk there that it won't happen, And I also look at the example of Napoleon, and this battle, it was called the Pratzen Heights. It was in modern day Czech Republic, where he used the fog to his advantage. Now, people might say, well, it was a foggy morning. How lucky was that? And in the story, he marches all his troops in the fog. The enemy don't see them approaching, and they launch this very successful surprise attack. And but he manipulated those set of events. First of all, he withdrew from high ground to an area that was prone to fog. Now, whether it was fog the next morning or not was still in the lap of the gods. But at least he manipulated his environment to capitalize on something that regularly happens, this fog. And not only that, when it did materialize, who knows how long it would last, he had his men mobilized and ready for action, and he took full advantage. And I think those two examples teach us a lot about life and business and everything that I think we need to know about how to create more opportunity for ourselves. So in society, for example, there's rarely a career that people have now for 40 years. So when I talk to, I mentioned the Dragon's Den program and scholarships, we do a lot of talks with schools, talk about skill diversification and the ability to equip yourself with be multi-skilled, be able to present like this, be able to write properly, be able to use, social media, all those things, and be able to take advantage then of a route that we might plot for ourselves and capitalize on opportunity along that route as we go. So when the fog appears, have ourselves and our people mobilized to take advantage of those opportunities that other people mightn't be quite as ready to jump on with both hands. And that's kind of the lesson of that chapter.
One of the things I think that all of you who have listened, have been with us for this entire time, will recognize is that the book is filled with examples and stories. Some you may have heard of, most of which you haven't heard of. And it's a great balance. It's a great mix. And I think that, my goal in doing these conversations, Adrian, is that people not only leave with tangible stuff, and we'll talk more about that. I'll say a couple more things about that before we're finished, but that they also get a sense of who the author is. Because once we know who the author is, we're far more likely, if we feel connected, to go out and get a copy of the book. In this case, it is Adrian Kelly's book, The Success Complex. So I have a couple comments or questions for you, Adrian, before we finish.
Yep.
And they're the common things I like to ask our guests, kind of like going back to where we started, knowing more about you. And one is, what do you do for fun?
I do a lot of running, actually. I ran a half marathon in the summer there. And so I'm in my late 40s now. I used to play baseball and used to play a bit of Gaelic football myself as well. But I like to run. Run's great for clearing your head. It's a great stress buster. We talked about stress. And I think it brings a lot of balance to my weekly kind of, my plan for each week is to try and get those runs done.
Running. And so then, what are you reading? Or what's something you've read recently?
Well, one of the books I read recently was The Irrational Ape. How Flawed Logic Puts Us All at Risk, and How Critical Thinking Can Save the World by David Robert Grimes. And I like this because there's also a lot in my book about flawed decision making, how we can make the wrong decision. And I focus on the Battle of Stalingrad in the book, Hitler and Stalin, and how each of them were very similar to begin with, and how Stalin started to change as various events happened, and how effectively he became more humble because he had that humility forced upon him with various defeats by Hitler and so on and so forth, and how he grew and changed his strategy from that. So, but it's very evident how bias, overconfidence, inability to take on information that's glaring right in front of us, or the people that are trusted to us are telling us, but we don't want to hear. They're real dangers. I think anybody that's out there working in a leadership role, if we're not open to taking on the right information, if we think we have all the answers, if we're overconfident and overbearing, it's a recipe for disaster. And I think that's why The Irrational Ape is also a great read for your listeners out there in terms of how people can make bad decisions, how good people with the right intentions can make very flawed decisions.
We will have a link to that in the show notes, as well as a link to Adrian's book, The Success Complex. But where else do you want to point people, Adrian? How can people connect with you, get to know more about what you're up to, learn more about the book, etc.?
For sure. So my website is askmore.ie. So ask more of ourselves, ask more of life. My primary social media is LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out and connect for sure. And also check me out on Spotify as well. We have a show there called The Success Complex, same name of the book. We have 3 episodes on there, 1 for each part of the book. And I interview 3 different people, 1 for each part of the book on those episodes, which I think is quite interesting. And I always like to give a plug as well to Marcus McGee, who was very helpful in assisting me with interviews. Marcus is a musician. He's just recently released an album called Rising from the Hollow. Very talented Irish guy, and he played at the book launch as well a couple of weeks ago. So plug there for Marcus.
All right, Rising from the Hollow.
Yeah.
And so I have a question now. Before I say goodbye to Adrian and say goodbye to all of you, I have a question for all of you. It's the question I ask you every week, every episode, and the question is, now what? What action will you take as a result of our conversation? And there's been plenty of things that Adrian's talked about and ideas that he has shared. But ideas and knowledge are one thing. Action is something entirely different. And so it's my challenge to you to decide what action you will take as a result of being here, because it is in the action that the change will come. I hope that you will do that. I hope you'll think about that. I hope you'll take action on what you learned today. And I hope that you'll be back next week. Adrian, thanks for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you, sir.
Thanks, Kevin. It's been a real pleasure being on your show, and well done.
And everybody, we will be back next week, so make sure you come back. If you're not subscribed wherever you're listening, do that. If you are subscribed, invite someone to join you. That'd be a great thing for them. Everybody wins, by the way, if you invite someone else to join. You win, I win, and they win. Hope you have a great week, everybody. And like I said, we'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.